Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Nat Wolff discovers that he has powers beyond imagining in Mortal, the new film from the director of Troll Hunter. Eric, played by Nat Wolff, is a Norwegian-American living in the wilderness who is arrested after he kills a teenager just by touching him. As the police try to interrogate him, Eric meets psychologist Christine, played by Iben Akerlie, who soon discovers that Eric has immense and dangerous powers that he can barely control. With Christine's help, Eric manages to escape the authorities and goes to find the origin and meaning behind his abilities, all the while being pursued by police and the US Embassy, who are trying to recapture Eric. Mortal is the latest film from Norwegian director André Øvredal, best known for the cult hit Troll Hunter, which he's managed to parlay into a series of English-language features like The Autopsy of Jane Doe and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. His new film sees him return to his native Norway and is both in English and in Norwegian, and like Troll Hunter, it draws a lot of inspiration from local folklore and mythology, but the difference between the two films is radical in terms of tone. Troll Hunter, which I really enjoyed when I watched it a few years back, is a mockumentary, and while it definitely has some horror elements, it's firmly tongue-in-cheek. It's worth remembering that film is largely made up of a cast of local comedians, and while it dealt with themes of government cover-ups and conspiracy theories, it never really took them all that seriously, and there's a clear satirical bent to the movie, which is most obvious in its final moments, where they used real-life news footage re-edited to make it look like a senior Norwegian politician was admitting to the existence of trolls in a fairly amusing way. Unfortunately, Mortal has no such sense of humour, and it probably doesn't take a wild leap of imagination to work out what part of Norse legend that the film is dealing with. Mortal did come out in Scandinavia theatrically at the beginning of the year, but across the rest of the world it's been a VOD release, largely due to COVID, but I also think because the movie isn't really entirely successful in what it tries to set out to be. Mortal starts off with the dictionary definition of the word, which is never really a great sign, but at least establishes very quickly the theme of the movie, and the character of Eric in particular. He's someone who's got these godlike powers, but now he has to decide what he's going to use them for. As the old adage goes, with great power comes great responsibility. So immediately we're stepping around in the superhero genre and the tried and tested origin story. And Mortal clearly wants to be a morality play. It wants to be someone deciding whether or not they're going to use their powers for good or evil. Is he going to be the Messiah or the Antichrist? And it's about those experiences and choices that make those decisions. It's about our humanity in the face of the fantastic. And clearly, Øvredal wants to take the genre and kind of do something unexpected with it and play around with it in the same way he did with found footage movies in Troll Hunter. The problem is that playfulness doesn't really come across on screen. If anything, it feels like very familiar ground. A couple of years ago, Mortal might have seemed a bit more novel, but unfortunately, origin stories, even dark origin stories, are very much played out by now. Mortal reminded me a lot of last year's Brightburn, because while it isn't an out-and-out horror film like that movie is, which is actually quite surprising given the pedigree of the director, it does wrestle with a lot of the same themes and ideas, and especially that just because you have these powers, it doesn't make you innately good. And what happens if that ends up falling into the wrong hands? But even before that, I wouldn't say that this is especially new, even going back to something like Chronicle, for example, which has a lot of the same ideas. Chronicle and Brightburn, like Mortal, tries to subvert the superhero genre by grounding it in this fantastical realism, and in a time when even mainstream superhero movies have embraced their own darkness, especially in the DC cinematic universe, it doesn't feel particularly novel these days to just go, hey, it's a dark take on superheroes, because we've seen lots of dark superheroes before. We've seen what happens in what would be reality depicted on screen before. The only real difference between Mortal and most of the other examples is that it's set in Norway, and even that I wouldn't really say sets it apart too much, because again, Brightburn was set in a small town in much the same way that Mortal is. So even the things that make it seemingly stand apart at first glance, when you watch it, you just get a feeling of deja vu about it. It does feel like a lot of the things that we could explore with the superhero genre have started to get a little bit played out by this point. And just because you're a bit of a moody take on it all, that doesn't set you apart. You need something more than that. What I will say about Mortal is that it does start off very strongly. The opening act in particular does set up a movie that could have had the potential to do something different, especially in the way that it introduces Eric. He's been living in the woods, he's a hermit, he's got this big overgrown beard. It's clear that he's shunned civilization for a very long time and mostly communicates with grunts. And I was actually quite impressed with Nat Wolff's performance in this film. Up until this point, Wolff has mostly been playing high schoolers and then sort of graduated up into rookies or screw-up brothers. Here, he's very much cast against type, and actually, it works fairly well, especially because there is something a little bit moody and twitchy about him, especially in the way that he mumbles this quite limited dialogue, so you're never quite sure if you've actually got a handle on him, if he has got something quite sinister running through him, but he does also give the character enough moments of levity that he also has a certain amount of humanity to him. And I do think that there are moments where Wolff's performance stumbles a little bit. I do think that Wolff just naturally has that kind of frat bro-y kind of vibe to him, and I've found that off-putting in some of the roles I've seen him in the past, and occasionally that creeps in here when the character's a little less angsty, but here I do think for the most part he commits to what is actually a really challenging role, and I was very much impressed by that performance. And the more intimate, smaller scale of the film makes the big set piece moments have greater impact. You really get to see this in the interrogation room, which is our first proper taste of Eric's abilities, and the way that he splits the room in two effectively is both awesome and frightening, especially for Eric, because he's clearly not in full command of his abilities, and so he's just as frightened as she is. Likewise, a similar sequence soon after where they try to extradite him on a helicopter and he creates a storm that makes the helicopter crash, that is also really visceral and immediate, and also it establishes him as a character where you're never quite sure what the limits of his powers are, but also what his motivations are, whether or not he's using this for good or ill, and so that always seems to be flipping over the course of the film. You're never quite sure if he's going to be selfish or whether he's actually going to be helpful and altruistic, and that makes for an interesting story at first, but then the problem is that Mortal doesn't really know where to go from there. The big problem with the movie is that honestly, a lot of the time when I was watching it, it felt like I was watching a first draft. It felt like, good concept, you didn't know where to take this at all. The second act is basically a road movie where Eric tags along with Christine and they travel back to where his powers first manifested. And in a way, it's Eric rediscovering his cultural history and heritage. His family is of Norwegian descent, but he moved to America, so he came back to Norway to rediscover that, and that's where they first occurred. And so Eric is in some ways an audience surrogate. He's someone for whom the other characters can explain these concepts to, but also he's an outcast within Norway. You see this in the opening scene where the teens pick on him because he's speaking English. It immediately sets him apart. It immediately lets them know that he's not from around here. So in that way, it's about those sort of ideas of identity, but also I think that the second act is where the movie starts to lose a lot of its momentum, because the conversations between Eric and Christine are largely expository. It's her telling him these things, and vice versa. There isn't really a lot going on, and it isn't helped by the fact that I feel like the movie's budget was clearly a heavy restriction. Eric is having these visions of another world and wandering around it, but all we see, of course, is him wandering around the back of a petrol station. It also doesn't help that Christine isn't really much of a character. She's initially introduced as someone who has very recently lost a patient who expressed suicidal thoughts, but she didn't believe him. So you would have thought that her character arc through the movie was learning to go on faith, learning to believe Eric when no one else will. The problem is that because the movie establishes very early on that this is real, very plainly so, she just spends much of the rest of it ferrying him around by car and giving him someone to talk to, but also it undermines the character in general because she doesn't really have much of a story anymore. Yes, there is the idea that she's betraying the police and she's throwing away her career all for the sake of helping this guy, but too often that falls into the background. In concept, good idea for a character. In execution, it does very little with it. Mortal at least recovers some ground at the end of the second act with another big set-piece moment that is genuinely quite impressive, especially given the obvious limitations of the film, where they get cornered on a bridge and they get blockaded, and Eric summons up this enormous lightning strike on the bridge, which again is another really, really exciting sequence that could have again showed that this movie wanted to do something worthy with the superhero genre. But as Mortal goes into its third act, it's clear that it simply didn't have the resources to do what it wanted with this concept. And in combination with the underwritten script, that makes for an enormously disappointing movie. It's in the latter section where we really get an understanding of what Eric's going through and what's happening to him. The problem is that arrives way too late for it to actually do anything with it. You can't introduce it about 65 minutes into a 90-minute movie and then expect to have anywhere to go. And the problem, especially in the later stages, is that it tries to expand the scope when it simply does not have the ability to do that. And the more that it tries to go for these big ideas, the less it fulfills them. There's these subplots all throughout the film that just don't really go anywhere. They completely fizzle out. For example, there's a subplot about the father of the teenager that Eric killed pursuing him out for vengeance, and that could have been a good mirror to Eric's own arcs throughout the film, but unfortunately that thread kind of gets lost, and then when it comes back, it ultimately goes nowhere. It's just sort of discarded. And again, that could have been a key part of the movie that was expanded out with further rewrites. Likewise, you've got these big kind of theoretical debates that ever so briefly touched upon Eric's presence and what that means for various religions around the world. Literally, you just hear it in an offhanded line of, oh, well, what does this mean for Christianity and things like that? And I feel like if you're just going to say that in an 8-yard line, don't even have it in the movie at all. It just feels like it's bolted on and you have no real interest in exploring that. And that's what makes Mortal such an intensely frustrating film, because there's so much potential here. There's so much it could have done, and it feels like the least of any of it. And by far the worst aspect of it is the ending, where it feels like the production just straight up ran out of money. It feels like the movie is getting to a point where it's becoming something genuinely interesting. It's promising something, and then it just stops. It does this last second twist in 30 seconds before the credits. The ending of the movie couldn't have felt more abrupt if it ended like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where suddenly the police arrested everyone on the cast and crew. It feels like that. It's so unearned and so perplexing. It just happens so quickly, with no build-up whatsoever, and you just scratch your head going, what? Did that just happen? What? and it just makes the movie feel like a complete waste of time. It's an embarrassing ending. I can't recommend Mortal, not even to die-hard superhero fans who are desperate for something new, because honestly, it's just not good enough. I know this is a low-budget Norwegian film, and considering that, it is fairly impressive what they managed to pull off, but the limitations are very evident on screen. This is a crazily over-ambitious film that delivers oh so little. I did like some things about it. I think that Nat Wolff gives the best performance I've seen him give in anything to date, and I think that the set pieces are well orchestrated, but otherwise, this is a severe disappointment, especially for Overdahl, who up until this point has been a very solid director, but this script needed several more drafts before it was put in front of a camera. This is a classic case of great concept, good ideas, terrible execution, and the ending is borderline unforgivable. If you reach that point, you'll feel like you've been ripped off. And honestly, there just isn't all that much new here. You've seen these same ideas in movies that are either indies or even on the blockbuster level. And yes, I did like Mortal a little bit better than something like Brightburn, which was just 90 minutes of pure nihilism, but by comparison, Mortal is 90 minutes of wasted potential. Mortal sees Troll Hunter director André Øvredal returning to Norwegian folklore and mythology, but is far less successful in the latter outing, largely because it lacks the playfulness and humour of that film. While it tries to riff on the superhero genre in an unfamiliar setting, the origin story and themes of power and morality that it tries to work with are all too familiar, where simply having a dark take on those tropes simply isn't enough to make it distinctive anymore. Although Nat Wolff does manage a surprise in the lead role, the film's biggest problem is that the script and story feel hugely underbaked, often feeling like there wasn't enough budget or scope to explore the premise in the way that it wants, with a staggeringly abrupt ending just as it starts getting interesting that is hugely unsatisfying. If you like this review, then use your powers over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.